So yeah, this is Auden's tribute in 3 parts to W.B. Yeats on the occasion of his death. It's called In Memory of W.B. Yates, and I'll go ahead and read it. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By morning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poem. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Part 2. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making where executives would never want to tamper. Flows on south from ranches of isolation in the busy Greece, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. Part 3. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poet. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace shares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie, locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night, with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, deserts, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Mary, you requested we read this. Do you have like an initial comment or question you wanna toss out to maybe get us started?
Well, I chose it because, first of all, I love Auden because he's like a juggler. He can do any kind of verse about any kind of
As he demonstrates in this poem.
Yeah, so that's what. But then I thought, as we think of poetry in the ModPo vein, poetry is not dead, and it is important. And even though he said poetry cannot change the world, it does in a way, and especially through the ModPo experience. So that's why I thought it would be interesting for our group.
That's a good place to start. I think there is something very when he says, I'm trying to find it again, where he says poetry doesn't change the world. Where is that?
Yeah.
Middle of stanza 2.
It's in stanza 2. For poetry, yeah, okay.
It makes nothing happen.
It survives in the valley of making where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs for all towns that we believe in, die in. It survives a way of happening in the mouth. So he says for poetry makes nothing. It's interesting. So he's not outright saying that poetry is like, useless in some sort of like purely artistic way, right? Like that if we think of art as something that doesn't have like a practical use, he's saying that it makes nothing happen, but what it does, it still does something. And that I think, I don't know, should we start to parse these lines here in our sort of handy dandy more compact second section? In you were silly like us, your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Matt Ireland hurts you in the poetry. So there's a bit of the Irish, the Irish identity thing here that we were talking about earlier. Now, Ireland at its madness and horrid weather still for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. Like what a really like heady, almost like postmodern line. What does it mean? Like it survives in the valley of its making, where executives, who are the executives? Unia, do you have an idea?
I'm not really sure, but this reminds me of a quote of someone. I wrote that down recently because I was watching TV, and it was an artist, I think from Ukraine or something, because I think that was why he was on TV. And he said, art is the diagnosis and not the medicine. And this really reminds me of this right here, because I think that's what poetry is as well. I mean, it's the diagnosis, it's what artists do to kind of cope with the world. But it's not what makes the world whole again, it's just the diagnosis.
I like that, and I think that's very fitting here. Like let's run with that idea. So what is, if art is diagnostic, how is poetry performing its diagnosis in Auden's imagination here? And I think he means like he's kind of talking about Yeats, but he's also just, it's sort of an ars poetica. He's also kind of just talking about poetry in general. What does he imagine poetry does, perhaps to perform this diagnostic rather than like palliative function? Anybody have?
Well, the first thing to see is that when you see the first part, the end of the first part, as just a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of the day when one did something slightly unusual. It would mean that the death of Yeats is only important to some, and that goes well into in the valley of its making, where executives, people, well, in my mind, business people who are more busy with money than with something else, they would never want to tamper because it's not interesting enough to them, because it doesn't make something happen. It's a way of happening, a mouth. So it's really poetry as something that is not powerful, but a way of expressing. So indeed, a confirmation of a diagnostic.
That's great, and I think it's so essential to sort of connect the dots in this part here, right? Like it's, for poetry makes nothing happening, it is a way of happening, right? Or makes nothing happen, it is a way of happening. Anna?
I also think that he's just speaking of poetry as something that is just existing, and you can come into this valley of poetry if you want to. It is open for everyone, but it is also surviving because there are some people who keep it alive. And then he says, and this is to me the most important part, in part 3, he says, let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. And I guess it's kind of interesting because he's putting kind of like a synonym to Yeats, because he's just thinking like he is the Irish poetry, and it survived such a long time, and now this valley is kind of empty, and maybe someone has to come there and remember, so it can be kept alive, so it can survive. So to me, poetry is just something that can survive without other people, and even if in this valley it has to be kind of under protection, because if you're in a valley and then there's something like the weather, and you are protected in this valley because it's just kind of a bow, and it is protected, but you have to protect us as well. And I guess that is the primary thought of this.
It's there was a great connection of the valley with the vessel, and it's making me think of the various containers of poetry that are evoked here in this poem. And what you're saying about the valley, being something that anybody can enter, but something that's nevertheless needs to be protected, I find very interesting. And I wonder if we can maybe say more about like what the the container of poetry that Auden is imagining here, what its function is, or sort of what makes it unique. So I'm thinking of the executives. What a strange like call out, right? It's poetry will stay in its valley, its sort of vessel. A valley being something where water might collect, but also a place that might be protected from certain weather events. But it's also it's not hostile to the executives, but it's something that the executives, whoever they are, don't want to like go into. Let's go ahead, Anna, with you since this was your train of thought, and then we'll go to Mary.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because I love this interpretation. Like you can go into poetry and seek protection as well. It's needs to be protected. So the valley is not like you can overcome this valley if you see, for example, castles that are built on hills to see into those valleys. To be protected of enemies, but you can also search this valley to be protected in it as well. So maybe poetry just does not only need to be protected, it is also a protection for yourself, a place where you can seek something, where you can go into and just relax or find something more than just usual.
So yeah, that's interesting. There's this idea of, so there's the Irish vessel that's emptied of its poetry, right? As though like Yeats were born, and then like all the poetry of Ireland just kind of like accumulated in him and was like periodically let out, and then he died and it was all empty. So there's that kind of like that idea of the vessel as almost something that's like transmitting, and then there's this other idea of like a container, a different kind of vessel or container is something that's actually like protective, that you can go into, right? It's not something that things are flowing out of, rather it's something that like you can kind of seek refuge in. Mary, and then Kurt. Mary. Oh, yeah.
That's the very word executive, because executives make things happen. They execute a law, they're powerful. So they wouldn't want to tamper with ideas that spoil their power. And maybe poetry might do that. That's it.
Right. That's a good understanding. I'm still wondering who these executives are, though. Kurt.
Yeah, I was very struck by the vessel lie empty of its poetry, and I think I try to explain why. And I think it's because usually when someone dies, you sort of think, well, I wish you could live more and give us a little more poetry. And so there's something fatalistic about it. They're saying that, well, he died at the right time when he was used up. And so you're saying that it was meant to be somehow, because you can't just say, hey, he's empty. Well, he could have lived another 10 years and give us some more poetry. But no, he was empty. By definition, he's dead. He's not going to come anymore, period. And so that's what I think that's why I was struck by that line.
It is striking, and it's almost a way of grappling with his death and his no longer being here in a way, right? And saying like, by kind of forestalling the question of what could have been and what more there could have been, by saying like, yeah, I mean, he was used up, and this is it. There was going to be no more poetry. Obviously, nobody would really believe that, but it's a way of memorializing him, right? To sort of tie his biological existence to his poetic capacity.
But isn't he emptied by death? I mean, it's more the way you now describe it is like he was emptied of his poetry, as so it's okay, he died. Is that the other way around, that death made it for him impossible to write more poetry? And on the other hand, he's emptied of his poetry because it's spread out into the world, and a lot of the poem is about other people interpreting the poetry of Yeats when he's no longer here.
There's so this conversation makes me want to look. Christian, did you
Your
have anything
gift
to add?
survived it. Your gift, his poetry, survived it all. So
Sure.
when it was he is empty and his gift is still there. It's a way of happening.
There's there's like a comparison I want to pursue here with the last poem, kind of about this idea of the self, the individual, the ego, you know, the male genius being or encountering something larger than it. Because I think that's taking place here in this poem. It's not as like it's not as like horrifying as it is in the other poem, but I think something similar is taking place. But Christian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was wanted to come back to the valley. You know, in wartime, the valley is the dangerous place. Like, you know, you want to be on higher level to be able to see things and to be able to defend yourself. So the poet is in the valley, like they create the valley, but the valley is also where everything flows. It's like where the flow of things and the you know, in order to go from one place to another, you need to go through the valley. And the executives don't want to go in the valley because that's dangerous. But the poet creates the valley where it's a place where things move.
That's that's I like that reading a lot of the flow. So the valley is created by the flow of the river. I mean, you know what, I'm not a geologist, I don't know if that's true, but I think there's some relation to the flow of the river and the valley, right? That's just suggesting, because yeah, maybe, you know, maybe it could be something else. But I think that is quite pertinent here. The things run down into the valley. Anna, do you have something to add there?
And the executives don't want to go in the valley because that is the dangerous part.
Right. And it's strategic. Yeah. So higher ground is always strategically better in a conflict. Anna, did you have something to add?
Yeah, also according to the valley, maybe the valley is just a place you can divide kind of in two places, because at the one hand, of course, it can be dangerous, but at the other hand, the term alone lets me think of something like peace. So the valley of peace. And there's in the valley, there's like forests and rivers and all those tiny little things that show there's life. So I just like the interpretation of movement in the valley, because it's kind of like you can or you have to protect this movement. And if you kind of say poetry is a synonym to this valley, or is in this valley, like being in a container, you can also say that poetry does mean movement, and maybe it also means life. And we read the first poem of the author himself, and it was also like that. There was kind of a movement in it, and there was kind of life in his poetry, and I guess maybe that's also the point.
Susanna and then Jenny.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer to Kurt, whether he's just dying and giving up kind of, and he won't write anymore. I think the first stanza really tells us how important their death is, because what we were just talking about, the valley and kind of the macroscopic view of the valley, is in the first stanza as a microscopic view of the landscape that is really spread out in the body of the poet, and also as the landscape itself. And that really goes so far into so many lines just describing what's going on in that landscape of the poet. And I find that as like a counterpoint to what Kurt said, and what we find in the second stanza, where we just take the metaphor of the valley, and in the first we have it all spread out in words, and it described in length, like really spread out, like a landscape is spread out.
So let's go to Jenny, and then we can sort of unfurl some of these like spatial things that are taking place. Jenny and then Mark, and then we'll go.
I just want to look at the end of this stanza when it's saying it survives a way of happening a mouth. And the mouth refers back to the very first verse when you have the mouth of the dying day. But the bit before the mouth, from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in, it survives, a way of happening a mouth. And if you go to the very end of the third stanza, the last two verses, with the farming of a verse, which goes back to your ranches of isolation, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. But then, in the deserts of the heart, which goes back to the second coming, let the healing fountain start, in the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Auden is leaving us with a much more upbeat ending than Yeats did.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Mouth of poetry to do something completely different. And I like that as an example of the mouth of poetry.
It is very upbeat and it almost, I know this is Auden, he's a different poet and he's commemorating Yeats, but there's something that, but you know, when you read these poems side by side and you actually read what Yeats was writing about, there's something kind of incongruous about the upbeat note of that throughout this poem. You know, he's writing this in 1939, and instead of being like, oh my God, like Yeats is dead and he was so right, like this shit's gonna hit the fan. He's kind of like, yeah, you know, he's created a way for us to, you know, he's been more optimistic about the future. Mark, did you want to add something?
Yes, so to me, valley is an image for deeper meaning. The valley is the landscape that goes down. We lift up our eyes to the mountains, but the deeper meaning that is in the valley. To me, it's an image for deeper meaning. For poetry, makes nothing happen. Literature offers no solutions and no instructions how to change the world, but literature accuses. It makes obvious what's going wrong, and that's what he says here. It survives in the valley. It survives in the deeper meanings. That is what Yeats has left behind. Max, you mentioned these three parts, and three parts indicate that this is an elegy. Elegies are usually written in three parts. First, it starts with what has happened, namely somebody died and everybody's mourning. And then the second part is about what the dead person has left behind. And section 3 continues with the future, what can happen.
Right.
And this Irish vessel that is mentioned, it alludes to the mythological bark, to the sticks where the dead people go to. Yeats is a poet. We're part of literature. It's the realm of mythology, and he is in that vessel, in this ferry, the spark that goes down the sticks, but it's empty. Nothing is in there anymore. We have lost somebody.
He's crossed the river in the sort of classical notion of the river of
right.
Sticks, right? Mary?
I think we jumped over one of the most important lines in the second stanza of the first part, when he said the death of the poet was kept from his poems. That means the poems don't die, they just keep going. As what Jeroen said before, that they become international, they become worldwide and meaningful. So the death of the poet was kept from his poems. There were no death for the poetry.
That's thanks for that, Mary, because that leads right into the question that I wanted to ask, which is what is Auden saying about, so we have a little bit of a sense of what he's saying about the death of Yeats in particular, we have a sense of what he's saying about poetry in a somewhat more abstract, general way. But what is Auden's philosophy or theory of poets dying in general? So they, we have this idea that in this line that you just read for us, Mary, the death of the poet was kept from his poems, and we have, elsewhere we see this idea of the vessel, the empty vessel of the poet, his poems now belonging to, in this case to the nation. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. They can belong to the world or something. They can belong to everybody else. So what is his theory of poets of poets dying, or maybe even death in a even larger way? Jeroen, did you have something to?
Yeah, in almost the end of the first part, he says the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So that's his idea is that we, the living, can do whatever we want with the words of the dead man. They're modified, so they don't stay the same. And the guts, the innards, that's really the part that we digest the dead man and change it to change his words to what we need or what we think. So it's kind of brutal.
Yeah. Can you point us to that line again? Sorry, I'm just.
It's mostly at the end of the first part. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living.
Somebody's phone. And right, okay. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So we need to actually figure out what the heck is going on here. Really, where the sense of scale is all over the place. And we're starting with, he's scattered among 100 cities. Okay, it's a nice idea. And wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. Okay, so now, being in other cities means some sort of encounter with strangers or with others. To find his happiness in another kind of wood. Okay, so we're not in the city anymore. Now we're in a rural setting. So we
that's what I landscape, Max. That he's spreading out this vast landscape where the poet is residing in some ways, and however he resides in the poetry, and also it's not quite. It is. He refers to the provinces, the squares, the suburbs. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Right. There's the suburb is this sort of blurring of city and wood. So yeah, he's spreading out vastly across the landscape to the point of being in foreign, is his foreign code of conscience, to being in foreign nations, right? So he's going further, exceeding the boundaries of his own nation. But then this last bit, the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So he almost enters, if we go with the landscape thing, he enters the earth, becomes part of the soil, as part of an agricultural process. He's feeding now the things that people eat, which are being modified, metabolized in the guts of the living. And so he becomes microbiotic or something.
It's leaves of grass all over again.
Yeah, it's leaves of grass all over again.
With the farming of a verse, making a vineyard of the curse. So that's in the last stanza. We have that farming aspect also.
So he's becoming something consumed in a very literal way. Anna, do you have something to add here?
Yeah, I guess he does not only play with the landscape, but he does also play with the weather. In general, he's playing a lot with nature, using metaphors and so on. But in the first part, at the really end, it says what instruments we have agreed. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. And what's striking to me is that he said that at the very beginning as well, in line 6. He also said that. And Well, repetition just means he wants to stress something out. He wants to express something really strong. And it was a dark and cold day. So if you just read those 3 words at the really end of it, it just says that about the death of the poem himself, that it was well, sad, yes, but it was more than sad. It was dark and it was cold. So it's not only a feeling, you can also see it, kind of. And to me, this is just a striking line because he repeats it, and I guess this repetition is kind of important.
Yeah, I'm looking for the first instance again. Right, it's oh, it's at the end of course, yeah, it's the end of the first stanza. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. That's kind of cool too. I think that there's this sort of juxtaposition being set up with 2 different kinds of worlds in this poem, and so right, the instruments can measure, as you're saying, Anna, they can measure that it was in fact a dark, cold day. Like the weather seemed to be like in sympathy with what was happening, right? Like it was like a big, you know, a titan of poetry died, and the weather seems to be mourning with him too. And you know, of course, weather is a very local phenomenon, so that calls into question, you know, where this is exactly, that the weather is dark and cold. But in some ways, the way he repeats about the instruments, the instruments we have agreed that it was a dark, cold day. It seems like very different in some other ways than some of the other natural language that he's invoking. Kurt, do you?
Yeah, let me propose this. I love it when they repeat things. It's sort of like a refrain in a song. It seems to be like the universal that you return to. You went off to this little land, and now, oh, by the way, I'm going to come back to the center. And the way I see it is this: the first instruments, he's talking about instruments like a thermometer. But the second time, it's like a concluding statement, and he's talking about our instruments of our mind. Is that he's doing all this reflection. Oh yeah, by the way, the instruments we have, including my capability to reason and to write poetry, you return to the same conclusion. And I think that's why you come back to the same sentence. You sort of evaluate in a new way, and you say, this is the universal line. And I like the idea that the instruments is our mind. And the second time he says it.
The instruments, so what instruments we have, what faculties we have, what senses we have.
Yeah.
Right, as sort of empirical proof of what our weather instruments, thermometers and barometers and so forth, are also confirming. Jenny and then Susanna.
I just wanted to come back to the way that all the way through this poem, he's comparing rural things and urban things.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important in Yeats, because before poems like The Second Coming, perhaps his best known poem was The Lake of Innisfree, which is a very approachable, comfortable nature poem. And by this constant comparison of the urban and the rural, he's reminding us that Yeats comes from these various different places.
The Lake Isle of Innisfree poem is 100% his second most famous poem. And there's I just have to look it up real quick because I had some sort of inkling of something, but I think maybe I'm wrong. Right, it's more of a nature poem, but also I think the Lake Isle of Innisfree is playing with right. He wrote the Lake Isle of Innisfree after he was walking around, I don't know, in a city, and he sees an advertisement or something, and it makes him, it just makes him so like fed up with the modern world that he's like, oh God, I would just love to be at the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And so that's what leads him to write that poem. So there's actually this sort of like urban rural tension in the creation of that poem itself. Susanna, and then Mark, and then Jeroen. And then
I just want to Kurt, I like your reading, and there's another reading about the feelings in it. The current of his feeling failed, he became his virus. So that's happened on the plane of feelings, whereas the instruments of the fail and the feeling fails as well.
Mark and then Jeroen.
Let me get back to the line, the day of his death was a dark and cold day. Did you notice that these are monosyllabic words? You only have one syllable. Each word consists of one syllable. He disappeared in the dead of winter, and now he has left us, and we are alone. All words only have one syllable. There isn't a second one that goes with all these words.
The day of his death was a dark, cold day. There's a nice meter in there too. Jeroen?
Yeah, I was elaborating on what Jenny said about all the different kind of landscapes. Essentially, when we talk about his poetry, there are two kinds of things. This really agricultural thing, like make it whatever, wine or something like that. And on the other hand, you have the urban. He is scattered among 100 cities, and so I think it's almost tragic that to find his happiness in another kind of wood. So the wood is the only place that is not urban and not agriculture. It's the only place of wilderness, and it's the only it's the only place where the poet can find his happiness when his words are being tossed over and eaten and everything. So he has to get away from his poetry to be happy.
That's really fascinating, and I think troubles some of the urban rural paradigms we would apply to an understanding of this poem, where and this is true also of the Yeats poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, where it's all about him building a cabin in the wilderness and sort of creating civilization in the wild. And now we have here this image of Yeats's spirit in some way, going somewhere wild where it can't be consumed, digested, or in some way like metabolized by society or civilization. Yeah, that's a cool understanding. The sort of frontier here of where where can poetry go to sort of be pure poetry in some way. We're at time here. So I mean, if we have like a couple minutes, I would invite like any final thought on this, but we can start to wrap this up. And we could like with any poem we could talk about it forever. Unfortunately, we don't have forever though. Does anybody any final thought on this poem?
Can anybody comment on the third section? It's so different to all the other sections. It has this sing-songy language. It sounds silly, funny, and if it is an elegy, why this sing-songy language at the end? Is it Robin from A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare talking to the audience? In Shakespeare, you always have these rhymes at the end of his plays.
It is surprisingly sing-songy, and I do find it somewhat strange. The allusion to like a Shakespearean comedy is apt though. Unia?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I think the rhymes and stuff just contribute to the whole positive attitude and the positive tone of the last stanza, because I think it's so nice. I don't remember who said earlier that this poem has this positive voice, whereas the other one we read was really negative. And I think it's so nice that even though Yeats has died and it's an elegy, which I find really interesting thought, it's nice that he ends so positively, and it's all about that poetry lives on. And even though it's not in the control of the poet anymore, and everyone can basically do whatever they want with the poem, it's nice that poetry is seen as this healing fountain, as they say at the end, because it's, I mean, wherever you read it and whenever you read it, you always see something new. There's new water bubbling to the surface, and you can just find something new every time.
Thanks, Celia. Jenny?
Just a very quick thank you to Mary, because I've never really read Auden at all. And I think this poem is so astounding in all sorts of different ways, but particularly in his use of language and his form, that I really want to explore him. So thank you for a whole new place to go, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. Indeed. Thank you so much for this recommendation. And next time we'll be reading a poem that you requested, Jenny. And so I've put up the schedule for next time, which is October 8th. I believe it's October 8th. So we'll read a Ginsberg poem and a contemporary poem that's riffing on that Ginsberg poem. Stanley, do you have something to say?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to close saying thank you, Max, for having this, because as Al said on Wednesday, he doesn't teach his classes anymore. He convenes his classes and allows them to figure out. In his first year class, he said, okay, we got 8 poems here. What do we want to do? What do we want to talk about? And he allowed the students to actually talk about what they wanted. And this is what I feel like. I didn't know anything about Auden. I knew a little bit about Yeats, not much, but I read the poem to I have a poetry group every Tuesday we meet, and we just rub words together is what we say. And it's 5 or 6 old guys, and we read poems that, you know, Billy Collins, whatever. But I read The Second Coming, and one of the 5 guys there actually got tears in his eyes with the slouching to Bethlehem. And I said to my wife, what do you think that did to him? And she said, well, he's probably, you know, pretty much a Christian or whatever. But I read that poem out loud to them, and I got some pretty good reactions. And now on Tuesday, I think I'll read the Auden poem. But, you know, we just take turns reading poems that we like and rubbing words together. And that's kind of what we did today. Thank you, Max. And I'll be glad to come back in October.
Well, thanks all of you for tuning in. And I'm so pleased that we have such a large and dedicated group, and also that we have some new faces in our midst too. That the group is growing, and I know that we have some folks from last, you know, some regulars who wanted to join, couldn't join today. So we'll hopefully be seeing them in October, and I hope to see all of you again, new folks. Please come back. Any questions for me here at the end of our session? Yeah, so I have I'll send around a reminder for our next meeting, which will take place on October 8th at 3 o'clock Central European Summertime, which is technically 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, but that's actually 2 p.m. UK time at the moment. So you can use Google if there's any confusion, but we'll be meeting at 3 o'clock German time. On Saturday, October 8th, and I'll send around more information about that, including the poems that we'll be discussing, and I'll do that about a week before we meet. So thanks everyone, enjoy your Saturdays. It's really super dreary in Berlin. I hope that it's a little sunnier wherever you all are. Is it, Jenny? Is it okay?
Yeah, absolutely beautiful sun. This morning I went picking blackberries and got too hot.
Oh, making me
Not a
jealous.
super high temperature, but the sun's warm.
Well, that's better than overcast and drizzling, but not committing to raining, which is exactly what we have here.
And is Anna actually a student of Mark's? Is that what?
Yep.
Wow. Thank you. The difference is spreading, guys.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekends, and see you in October.
See you.
Nice.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.